isolation is also very highly correlated. And economic frustration, people who are unable to make it in the current system that we live in, feel very aggressive and conflicted. Religious and ideological beliefs are critical catalysts for murderous behavior. I'm going to spend some time on the ideological beliefs that have been driving some of these white racist movements. Media attention. There is a great desire for 15 minutes, even if it's 15 minutes, with the most heinous behavior. Kind of, it still chills me to think of that, the murderer in Christchurch, who shall remain nameless, wandering around with a video camera on his head, taking photographs of what he was doing in order to establish his place in the 15 Minutes Hall of Fame. And whenever we see a permissive environment for intolerance, authoritarianism, for patriarchy, for misogyny, for racism, sexism, nationalism, militarism, you know that the prospects for mass murder, or even minor murder, increase. And when you have the kinds of environments that I think are kind of quite malicious, playing into normal militarism, that also creates a very pernicious environment for global conflict and global violence. Yesterday in the paper, Ciao Mussolini, who's the great-grandson of Benito, who's standing for the Italian Parliament, says, "I see other dangers: the thought police, globalism, the dictatorship of political correctness, uncontrolled immigration, a few small financial groups such as Code for the Jewish conspiracy that control everything, and Islamic extremism." And he was standing in Italy right now as his great-grandfather's great-grandson, on that agenda. Islamophobia, I gathered a lot of material about this, is right up there as creating an extremely permissive environment for these maladies. Boris Johnson referred to Muslim women in burqas and full burqas and so forth as bank robbers and letterboxers. And so speech about Muslims and the way they're reported have a very direct impact on the life of everyday Muslims and on our behavior. And statements such as Johnson's, which have become relatively normalized, create a permissive environment for dehumanization and violence. The Carter Center have got a lovely definition of Islamophobia. It's more than harsh talk. It's a systematic and institutional form of racism. It's the silencing of Muslim voices. It's selective condemnation. It's the constant, not so random stops at airports, checkpoints. It's the recently renewed travel bans, FBI surveillance and policing of the Muslim community. It's when merely speaking Arabic is mistaken for an extremist threat. It's asking Muslims to apologize for crimes they didn't commit. It's calling for a Muslim registry. It's a politician assuring worried voters that former President Obama is not a Muslim, but is in fact a very nice man, as if the two were mutually exclusive. It's not a Muslim problem, but it's an affront to our common humanity. It's a fundamental violation of human rights and human dignities. It's deeply connected with racism, xenophobia, and other forms of dehumanization. Serving to maintain prevailing power structures. Responding to Islamophobia, therefore, as part of our response to this massacre, is vital and a moral responsibility for policymakers, civil rights advocates, across religious, racial, and ethnic lines, interfaith movements, and organizations. The speech that we're talking about, hate speech, is also fueled and propelled by social media. Hateful extremist ideologies are amplified through the social media. Fearful individuals with loose social networks, fragile identities, and exclusion from mainstream institutions find sites all over the place where hate speech and violent acts are normalized. They also find narratives which speak directly to their nihilistic desire for empowerment through causes larger than themselves. And the Wall Street Journal had a very interesting article last year where hate spreads faster than truth or love. They showed that YouTube's algorithms more often recommended conspiracy theories, partisan viewpoints, misleading videos, and hate speech over more reputable but boring videos representing fact-based reporting or positive messages. Individuals searching for simplistic, lazy solutions to problems can find them, and these can be turned into murderous desire. But the internet is a very, very dangerous spot. So in terms of some of the profiles, I've mentioned profiles of mass shooters and murderers. I don't need to go through those in great detail. They're from Dietz. But they have organizational and ideological supports which are really critical to giving the ideas some flesh and blood. Most Western counterterrorism and countering violent extremism programs post 9/11 have been focused and oriented towards Muslim radical groups such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And the same with our own intelligence agencies. They focus their attention on Islam. Not Islamophobia, but Islam. And all of the Muslims who come and live in our countries. Nowhere near as much attention has been paid, on the other hand, to the white supremacist, white nationalist groups, which have been expanding in number and significance over the West in the same period of time. And there are many prominent groups which we've sort of lost sight of, or just assumed would never have any currency. But they've had huge currency in relation to Brexit, for example. They have huge currency in relation to Marine Le Pen's National Front in France, to the AFD, the Swedish Freedom Party, and to all of the right-wing political movements in Europe. And the Southern Poverty Law Centre documented the emergence of 101 anti-Muslim hate groups between 2016 and 2017. Australia and New Zealand are not immune, and these groups have been expanding here over the past 18 years. Paul Spoonley, who's been doing a lot of documentation on this, documented more than 17 New Zealand groups that meet the demand definition of being extreme right-wing, and the city that hosted most of these groups was Christchurch. They're a mixture of skinhead, neo-Nazi, and extreme nationalist groups. Some were traditional to their ideology with a strong underpinning of anti-Semitism and a belief in the supremacy of the British race. Others inverted the arguments of Maori nationalism to argue for separatism to keep the white race pure. And in 2014, one of these, the right-wing resistance group, which targets Polynesians, was founded by Carl Chapman, was actively recruiting in Taranaki and came to a unit set up in New Plymouth, and Stratford, and was establishing a Viking division in the region, this is right-wing resistance. But this is sort of a genealogy for racism, which I think we need to be conscious of and which we need to name. In 1998, the politician historian William Pember Reeves, who was a liberal reformer, wrote, quote, "The average colonist regards a Mongolian with revulsion, a Negro with contempt, and looks on an Australian black as very near to a wild beast. But he likes the Maoris and is sorry that they're dying out." I mean, these were our ancestors. This is a liberal ancestor who's creating an environment for racism which continues to this day. And in the 20th century, the White New Zealand League of Pukekohe stated, quote, "The serious danger with which civilization is threatened doesn't come from actual savages, or even those of a little plain who may be called barbarians. The peril is from those dark-skinned races which have long ago put on a thin veneer of semi-civilization that have remained for centuries without rising any higher, are really constitutionally incapable of rising higher. No better example of this class can be found with the Hindus, mentally and morally incapable of real civilization." So there's a very complex genealogy of hate and intolerance and xenophobia and racism which lies at the heart of New Zealand. And I think we need to acknowledge that. And here in Dunedin, there's a National Front rally. There's a group called Right Minds New Zealand, which is working to present New Zealand borders. There's the Defend New Zealand Sovereignty group, which is strongly opposed to UN and globalization and wants to reject the UN Global Migration Compact. And look at the logo of the United Nations there with a number of bullets there, and also playing on the patriotism of our First World War soldiers. And in terms of mobilization, they had an ad in the paper just a week or so ago saying, "Bring your own New Zealand flag and yellow vest," trying to link up with the yellow vests in France. The Dominion movement has a strong sense of victimhood and desires a rebirth, quote, "of traditional Kiwi society, or what amounts to a white nationalist state. Immigrants are described as unworthy imports, white New Zealanders overrun by multiculturalism and denigrated by both government and media. They say we're building a brotherhood of New Zealanders bound by blood, culture and flag, committed to fulfilling our duty to our nation. We say, not here, this is our home. We refuse to surrender it to immigrant masses foreign political saboteurs, Chinese oligarchs, and the forces of international finance. This was a quote from last year. There are some New Zealand Dominion movement members. Here's a Dominion group gathering, and all of the faces are blocked out, but you can see that they're promoting family, community, nation. I promote family and community, nation as well, but we have very different understandings of what this means. Their understanding of family is heavily patriarchal and white. Their understanding of community is one which looks a little bit like Clapham Junction. Their understanding of nation is the British nation writ large and taking its new shape and form on the other side of the world. And here are some Dominion Group posters promoting some of their reference groups, welcoming Boer refugees, so picking up some of the South African racism. And if you look at We Are Growing Stronger, it's using, what is it, Hochdeutsch, some German style script to promote New Zealand nationalism. So members of these groups are young, they're white, Kiwi men who belong here. They have as much right as you and I to be here. They feel disenfranchised by millennial quandaries, climate change, the global financial crisis, worsening economic and employment prospects, and widening inequality. Their propaganda refers to democracy, consumerism, international finance, multiculturalism, and feminism as threats to their way of life and their own identity. They're strongly homophobic, misogynist, Islamophobic, and they don't want anyone interfering with their guns.